Hi guys, welcome back to the Writing Craft Podcast. I'm your host, Jenna.
And I'm your host, Holly, and today we are going to be talking about world building, doing our second part where we actually give you some more actionable tips and techniques since we were going more big picture last time.
Yeah, definitely. And I know Holly's got a lot of notes that we didn't get to touch on last time, so I'm handing it over to her and I will jump in when I feel the need to.
Excellent. So I actually there's a blog that I wrote a while back that has been my sort of go-to because I didn't know it would get so popular. I it's when I started a Tumblr account and I was doing some posting and people just like it a lot. So I thought, well, if we're talking world building, I should sort of go over those points because my goal with it was to create something that was very simple because I know, especially considering what we talked about last time and all of the stuff that goes into world building, all of the like cultural considerations and all of these things like different when you're creating different like races and cities and universes and all of that, that can seem very daunting, right? Like world building can seem like such a huge thing because you are literally building a world. So this thing I just created it as like a starter pack basically for anyone who has not done this before but who wants to and who wants to get into it, and I think it gives you the basic considerations that you would need. And so for today I was curious to find out how Jenna works as well, so I figured I would go over my base method and then you can sort of go over your base method and jump off of that.
Sounds good.
Yeah. Alrighty. So the way I did this, I have divided it up into 6 parts, which is who, what, where, when, why, and how, which sort of took me back to like elementary school writing. I remember always addressing those points when we would be writing stories and stuff like that. And I thought, yeah, let's just do this because I like that. Sometimes it's good to take it back, and I'm in nostalgia mode right now anyway. All right. So when you are starting your world building, a great place to start is with who. The primary question being like who lives in your world. So generally there's going to be a variety of species and races, or you could do a world where every creature is exactly alike. It is, your world. But you'd be wondering like, do the creatures of your planet have different cultures or are these homogenous? And by the way, I am dealing very much in fantasy world building here. We did sort of talk about that difference last time where there's like fantasy world building versus the world building you do in a more like mundane real world story. So this is very fantasy based. Um, and I found that it's easiest to start off with your main character and then kind of work out from there. Like, what is their species and race? What does their culture look like? And one little exercise you can do is jot down species name, race names, physical descriptions, language, cultural notes, sort of like the way their culture might be, and things like special abilities. So that's the little starter point for who. Moving on to what, the question you would start with is what social structures exist in your society. So again, I would say start with your main characters and work out from there. For each group in your world, you're going to need to determine how they manage their society. Like, what beliefs do they have? Do they have religion? Are they sort of philosophical, non-religious? Or do you have both? Is there a divide between the two? What do their political structures look like? And how strict are their laws? And there's also trade and economy, which is, I don't like that area too much. I find it really boring. But there's those areas where like it's boring, but it's going to come up. Like if your character is buying something, you kind of want to know how they're buying it, right? um,
Yeah. And I think too it has a lot to do with like the map as well. So eventually, you're going to want a map if you're writing like a story that takes place in an alternate world, or even if it's in a small town, you're going to want to make sure that where they're going makes sense, and that sometimes has to do with the economy, because if they're like in a landlocked place with no water sources around and your main character is casually buying fish,
mhm.
and people can see on your map where they are, it's kind of confusing. Or if they're in the desert, it's
Yeah.
It's like
That
retconning your own world.
exactly. You can't just assume like, oh, they can get anything wherever they are. Like, no, that's not always possible. And then with your example, it might be something like, oh, they're buying fish, but they're in this landlocked area. So then you would want the fish to be like very expensive, like a luxury item because it's, been imported across a distance. So it's that economy is really going to affect a lot of storytelling, as boring as you may find it at first.
I mean, it just lends to the believability of the story.
Yeah, and also if you have something like a world with a barter system, that builds into it as well. You have that whole thing of people bartering and like those interactions that you can build into your dialogue, etc. So, and the thing is, like, it is pretty big, so you might not want to go too in depth with like every single group in your world, but you'll want a basic note or two about each just in case it does come up. And my exercise for this is just write at least one point about each of the following, which is religion, philosophies, politics and laws, and economy, just so you have like a bit of a grasp on it. Uh, my next point is where. And the question that we start with is where do they exist? So finally, we get to the sort of physical world of the world building where you're going to be looking at like, what is the geography like? The biomes? Is the world bountiful with resources, or is it like a dying planet with species in desperate need of like new sustenance? So that's going to change a whole lot of things. And I find that for some writers, they'll take years and years to flesh out the where of the world, including the cosmos surrounding it. I don't know how deep you go with this, Jenna, or if you've run into anyone like this, but I have a friend who we would talk about writing, and he doesn't do novels, but he does D&D campaigns. And he downloaded apps where he could make his own solar system. And he was like, he had an entire solar system and knew where like the sun was going to be and all of this stuff. And I was like, that is so impressive.
Oh, man, I'm gonna need to know what app that is for when I go back to my space opera, but
Yeah.
I don't have it as in depth as that. I've definitely drawn pictures of like the solar systems that are important, especially if they visit multiple planets on one system.
Hmm.
But for the most part, I'll have like what planet. I'll have like a list in a Google Doc of like this is the name of this system. These are the planets a part of them, and then these are like who is a part of this planet. This is when this planet shows up in the plot. Those types of things.
Yeah.
And I'll have like, a general overview of like the Milky Way galaxy and where each system in my mind is kind of generally located. Not definitely down to like a T in any way. If I like put even a one dot somewhere, it's going to consist of like a couple thousand solar systems.
Hmm.
So it's not exact. It's just like a general overview. That way I know what systems are close to each other. But when it comes to fantasy, I'm not really thinking of that too much, unless of course it's like my call it a secret or like in my angsty project on the side that I don't tell people too much about because I don't want someone to steal the idea. This one I have
Mm.
like on lock. But for that one, minor thing I can say about it is that there is a world where half it's like land it's like I forgot what the word is. Um but half the planet gets the sun and half the planet only sees the moon, so it's like tidal lock, I think
Oh,
that's what it's called. And
okay.
that has to do with the powers and the system, the magic system, and how the whole world works. So researching the science of what a tidal locked planet would look and act like and what the plant life would be like, what it's like in that slight sliver in between where they can see both the sun and the moon at the same time.
Mm.
That's only kind of the times when the sciencey element will kind of insert itself into fantasy for me, or
That's
if like
cool.
I'm writing a story if it has two moons, those kinds of things. But
Yeah.
for the most part, I let the science stay in my space opera. But other people feel free to blend those things together.
Well, and that's why when I was saying that, I was like, wait a minute, you do some space stuff. I feel like you must do a bit of this.
I
And
may or may not have taken an entire astronomy class just to make sure that my book was accurate.
I love that. I love that so much. And I mean, when I was writing these notes down too, I was thinking there's still more of this that I need to do with my world, my big world, and I want to make like different astrological signs and stuff for my world, and that's something I haven't done yet, but I'm
Ooh.
going to, and I'm going to sort of work it in a little bit, which will be fun because I mean, we love our astrology here.
Yeah, I
But
definitely wanted to do that too, and like my own version of tarot cards inside of a world
yeah.
as well.
Yeah.
But those are like fun things in world building that like don't pertain exactly to the plot and are more fun
Yeah.
side things, at least for my work. So
Hmm.
I haven't gotten to them yet.
Yeah, that's it for me too. Like it's not a main plot point, so I'm gonna do this and then maybe it'll come in a little bit at some point. But
It is cool for
yeah,
branding though. Like I don't know if you've seen
exactly.
Curious Tides, but that book
Mm,
has like the different houses fall under the different moon phases. And so I think
okay.
she has like the author has a quiz where you can figure out what moon sign, aka what house you're under.
Okay.
And then they all have like different symbols and things like that. Very Harry Potter esque
Oh,
energy.
I love
Um,
that.
yeah.
I always want to do something like that because I'm someone who loves creating those different types of houses and the things that people can identify with. And I think I'm going to do that in one of my upcoming novels, but I have to finish Centera first. That's my mantra this year: finish Centera, finish Centera. But I'm planning to do a Montreal-based story with some historical stuff in it, and that's going to be my 2024
Ooh.
NaNoWriMo project, and I'm going to work some of that in. I'm very excited about it. Yeah.
Oh, that's so fun. I've always wanted to do it too, but I just haven't had the right whip for it yet. But
Yeah, that's the thing. And I don't want to force it because then it feels like you can't base it around that sort of thing because then it's probably going to sound derivative. But if it fits in, then that's cool.
yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, some people I've known take years, they flesh out the entire cosmos. But for others, kind of, me right now, a map with basic locations will suffice. So it's kind of up to you how in depth you want to go, right? And I would say at the very least, you should outline one or two notes. So here's the little to do again: one or two notes about each of the following, which is solar system. Does your world exist near ours or is it completely fabricated? Geography, this could be split per species. Forest elves live in the woods, nymphs are near the sea, etc. Biomes, again, by split by region, and resources split by region. So that's our very simplified where. Next up, I have when, which is ask yourself, when do the events of your story occur? The story that you're telling, it might be the main focus of your book, but what happened to lead up to it? What's your main character's species and world been through that is causing this to occur? Even if the events of the world don't necessarily impact your story much, they will have, they'll have had some level of ripple effect that reflects on your character's day to day. So like you can't avoid that. So you want to know, was this civilization like a warring one and the story takes place in a broken society, or is this a society that's reached like its peak of enterprise or something like that? So I think it's important to know a bit about history, or a lot about the history. And I would tell people to, if you're figuring out what to establish first, establish some founding events, defining events, recent events, and then, if relevant, future events. So you just know where you are on the timeline. And I mean, that's going to affect stuff a lot. And I think we talked last time about like the Easter eggs and things you can put in with world building. And I think history is a big thing that will help to create that, right? Like if you know all these things that are happening and you can add little like, oh, there's a portrait of this historical person on the wall. And if you bring it up, you can make all these things that point back to each other. And it just makes it even more in depth and rich.
Oh, definitely. And I think it's that richness that makes worlds feel so real and it makes people want to write fan fiction and wants it to be turned into a movie. They want to know like all of the lore. And it's because if they feel like they're missing something and they love the story well enough, they want to
Mm-hmm.
dive in deeper into it. And all of that comes back into, not necessarily you knowing every little thing ever in your world. That's a bit too much for so many people. Some people, granted, they want to know literally like everything down to the smallest snail or ant on the ground. Be my guest if that is you as a
Yeah.
writer. But for the most part, even if you're just like teasing that there are more things that you don't know and the reader knows, it gives this feeling of depth. So even if like
Mm-hmm.
you don't ever explain the portrait fully, or you know more about the portrait than somebody else does, or the reader knows, or even the characters know, you knowing more information than they know automatically creates this depth if you're writing it into the story with the assumption that you are hiding knowledge basically, but you
Yeah.
actually have the knowledge, not just you're
Exactly.
pretending. Like this is important, you'll
Yeah.
find out about it later and it never happens. That doesn't create a payoff.
Mm-hmm. And also, I think it's good to know up front because if you add it in later, it might not seem as natural. But if you know it like when you start and then something comes up in the sequel, but you did know it at the beginning of the first book, it is just going to flow all the more naturally rather than feel like it's been shoehorned in there.
Oh yeah, if you're doing it like I think too, there's different world building between what you're doing with a single book, like a standalone, versus if you're having a series. Because with the series, the more you know up front, the more you can sprinkle and Easter egg things throughout, which creates that depth and that richness in the world. Versus if you're like, oh, quick, I didn't think about this and I'm 5 books deep, let me throw it in there. It usually
Yeah.
ends up just being a
Yeah.
disappointment for people.
Yeah, and then you're going to have one reader at least who goes back and is like, "Here's this thing halfway through book 1 that completely contradicts what you did here." And it's like, "Damn it." So avoid that
Yeah.
if you're doing series. Because if people like your stuff, they are gonna like obsess over it and they're gonna find your mistakes.
Yeah, there's that, and there's also like even if they're not obsessing with it, if it's obvious enough, this is why critique partners and beta
Yeah.
readers are so important because when you're so close to the
Mhm.
story, like your eyes are crossing, you will not be able to tell when there's obvious mistakes. I was a critique partner for someone who hates to this day, as far as I know and I'm aware of, hates world building, hated everything to do with it. And I was her critique partner, and I read, her book was going through it, and she had established one thing about her world that was essential to the plot throughout the entire book, and then she retconned it at the end, and I was like,
Ugh.
this doesn't make sense. But she was like, I need the retcon to make the ending happen because it sets up book two.
Mm,
And I was like, well, I don't know what you're gonna do then because you can't set something up in the magic system and then break it with no explanation and then just expect people to go along, right?
yeah.
And so I caught that error right before the book was going to go to print because she was self-publishing. And then I know she ended up
Mm.
changing this entire thing, and a bunch of reviewers had actually loved the new ending. The reason why it was allowed to be retcon, I literally like handed her on a silver platter the reason why she could retcon it, and so she put that, and all of the
Mm.
reviews were like, "Oh my god, amazing ending!" And I was like, "That's the power of a good critique partner." Is that, and luckily
Yes.
that she was able to like accurately, implement it as well because it also takes good implementation. So it wasn't all just me, but like I
Mm.
handed it on a silver platter, gave her the reason because I was invested in the story and was able to catch her slip up, and she was like this with the story, so she couldn't
Yeah.
see the issue.
Very important to have those reviews and have people go over it. Very, very important because you are always going to be like way, way, way too close to your own story. When we talk about the why, which is my next part, I've got two more of my little helpful notes here to go through. So moving on to the why is, why do the species in your world behave as they do? So the why of your story will tie in with many of the previous points that I've outlined, but it gets more to the point in a way that can sort of directly apply to your story and characters. Like, why are things happening as they are today? What evolution did the society go through? Do they share common goals now, or are your characters going against the grain of their people? Like, what conflicts exist in the world, and is your main character involved in these, or are they attempting to like avoid involvement? And I think a few pertinent notes to take would be something about social evolution of the society you're writing within, the goals of the society as a whole, and the conflicts as a whole, just to sort of see the why of why people are behaving in a certain way, even if those larger conflicts, like say you have a character who's like avoiding being involved in this war and it's very like a side note, it's just something else that's like happening and they're avoiding it. People around them aren't necessarily going to be the same, so that's going to affect the fabric of everything. Like, why are people behaving the way they do? You want to know, like, if someone does something odd when they're walking down the street, like, why are they doing that? What state, like, what mental state is the society in? I think that that's an important thing to put across.
Yeah, and I think that's dual toned as well because not only if this person's walking down the street doing something weird, it's asking why is it weird and why is it happening? So it's the internal
Yeah.
why of why this character is acting strange and the external why is it society deemed this as weird in the first place. And I definitely have a lot more to say about this point, but that's going to have to be a part of my way of world building, which revolves
Okay.
around why.
Oh, excellent. Okay, so my final one here is the how of the story. And the question I start off with is, how do the species in your world solve problems? So, in the category of who, you're going to have gone through like what your main character's abilities are. These could be magical or technological, or maybe they're like super strong or super smart, or maybe they don't have any at all. Now you can get deeper into the magical or technological systems of the world. So you'd start with your main characters and work outwards. Is everyone magical here? Do different species and races have different abilities? Is there like a human or human related race? You see that a lot in fantasy. Like there's always going to be the Terran race or something like that that mirrors us a bit more. And like at what point are they in with their technologies if they're not magical? So you should figure out the following for each species and race within that if applicable. You want to know what their magic abilities are, if any, technological advancements, scientific knowledge, and militaristic power. Those are all going to be very important, especially in fantasy, because there's a lot of fantasy with like warring elements in it, and you're going to need to know those things. And my fantasy is, so I was very much writing with that sort of like big fantasy world war magic system classic thing in mind. So my tips very much apply to that because that's where my brain is right now.
Yeah, and I mean, I think for me too, the same thing with my Viking novel that I'm writing right now. It's very much delving into the consequences of war, the setup of war, military, and things like that. But the one thing I think that has been a problem, at least in fantasy, and it's more so a problem that used to be around, though I still see it happen now, so that's why I will mention it. But, you know, I would not try to break up, oh, this one species has all this military, they have all this viewpoint, they have all this way of thinking. Because if you're going to take an entire species, whether it's human, elves, dwarves, whatever it is, and all say they follow this one way of life, then it lacks a lot of depth, and we can also get into
Yeah.
problems with stereotyping in ways that we
Oh
don't
yeah.
wish to have. And so it's more so like, okay, in general, these are the, magical abilities. This is how this, species or race's history has gone. But then there's different sects of these groups. There's some that, dwarves
Mm-hmm.
who live in the mountains versus dwarves who live underground versus dwarves who live in the valley. They all have different subsections. And then within those, let's say in the mountains, there's actually a gang of dwarves who go and steal things from other people who are like passing through the valley, and they have beef with a gang of dwarves in the valley. Like that's so much
Yeah.
more interesting than saying all the dwarves live in the mountain and they're all thieves.
Yeah, like that's not a thing. I mean if you think about our world, right? And then you shrink it down because right now everyone, our intelligent species is humans and that's it. So you have that, but then think about all the differences we have on our planet, and then you want to take that and kind of shrink it down. If you have a world with multiple species like elves, dwarves, etc., think about there's going to be like a whole planet of difference for each one.
Definitely. And I think too, we can very easily sometimes look at, like at the example I gave you of the stereotype of all dwarves who live in the mountains, and all dwarves in general, they're all thieves, right?
Hmm.
That one isn't a good connotation for anything, because stories have power and words have power, and that could be applicable then to real life things, and we can sometimes get into bad connotations with that. But at the same time, it
Yeah.
lacks depth, it lacks richness. But we can also think, okay, well, let's say I am writing a world where there's dwarves in the mountains, dwarves underground, and dwarves in the valley. But let's say we have a bunch of people who live on the other side of the mountain whose only, they're humans, their only interactions with the dwarves are the ones on the mountain, and their only interaction with them is the people who are in the gang stealing from them. So then you can go, okay,
Hmm.
why then, and what would be their reaction as humans to these dwarves? They would automatically think all dwarves are then thieves living in the mountains because that's their own
Yeah.
and only worldview. And then you can create conflict with that. That's natural to your world that you've already set up
Hmm.
versus going, oh, humans and dwarves just hate each other and I don't know why. Okay, well, let's dive into that a little bit deeper and start creating out the worlds. And I mean, too, trying to set up on purpose, like let's say you have a whole story that's based around solely this idea that humans and dwarves hate each other. That's the plot of the book, right? And there's, obviously there's other characters, but you need to figure out the history and why these two factions are fighting. And you're just like, oh, well,
Mm-hmm.
they just don't like each other. That's when no one likes your book, because there's no depth there. Versus if
Yeah.
you're creating, okay, here's humans' whole society, here's dwarves' whole society, and then you start looking at where there's crossover. You start going, okay, well, why don't they like each other? Is it because they've had trade disagreements? Is it because of some sort of feud? Is it because the royal lines had beef back in the day? Is it because they have negative stereotypes of each other?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe the humans are out there thinking that they can give dwarven children better lives and are stealing their fucking kids. Like, there's all of these different ways
Yeah.
that they can interact negatively with each other, versus just saying, oh, they just don't like
Mm-hmm.
each other because they don't like each other. And that's like where
Yeah.
I get really passionate about world building, is figuring out the why. Like, why do not they like each other? Why is this world the way it is?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's very, very important. And I mean, any good fantasy story you read, if you start looking at it through that lens of like, okay, what work was done to make this seem, accurate and realistic, then you'll go, oh yeah, okay, they paid attention to history. They have the answers for all of these questions you might have. It isn't just two-dimensional. So that's my, my little rundown. If you want to take the reins and talk about some of your methods and tips, then please go ahead.
Yeah, definitely. Well, that was a bit of a teaser right there. Is just simply like, for me,
Yes.
it comes down to asking why. Because for me, characters come first. I know sort of usually the romantic dynamic that I want going on. And so if I'm deciding, okay, I'll use my Viking book for an example. If these two people start off as enemies and then eventually kind of move into more friends to lovers, allies to friends to lovers kind of pipeline, then why are they enemies? And this is how I first started conceptualizing my Viking book, was going, okay, well, I know starting off with, just the bare bone idea, the daydream of this story is that she's an elf living in like a colder climate. I want to base this on Viking stuff. And then for unknown reasons to me at the moment, she has beef with whatever faction the guy love interest comes from. Well, why do they have beef? Why are they not liking each other? Why do they have so much distrust from one another? Can I make that deeper into the elves and the humans just have so much distrust from one another? Why do they have that distrust? Why is that bridge and that gap so hard to jump? Why is the world set up the way that it is, so that I can understand and build from there? So rather than going, okay, well, I'm going to fill out a character sheet and I'm going to say, oh, this government's like this place is like this. It's in a desert, it's in mountains and the, the snowy peaks. Instead, I'm going, okay, I have this dynamic of this world that I know I want to have. I want to have this main character who's an elf, who is considered outside of human society, to end up basically becoming a religious icon for humans. How is that going to happen, and why is that going to happen? So I built the story and the world building from there, questioning, okay, well, why do they have beef? Well, let's say I'm going to change the name of this eventually, but for right now, the human like faction that the guy is from is called the Knights of the Divide. And so they basically do the same thing that Adelaide, the main character, does as a keeper of the divide. They both, go across the mountain range that divides New Alfheim from the rest of Midgard, and they keep the humans on one side and the elves on the other to keep them separate from one another.
Hmm.
The reason they have beef is because there used to be, if you know Norse mythology, Alfheim, which was the land of the elves, and humans ended up invading and destroying it. And so elves automatically have a
Yeah.
lot of distrust, because when they took a piece of Midgard for themselves, created their own land there, and they had a huge mountain range erected in between their land and the rest of them. And so they kept humans away, elves on the other side, and that's why easily I can now say Adelaide and Karsten, the two main characters and the love interests, they automatically have a lot of distrust towards one another that they'll have to, throughout the book, bridge the gap of, because she comes from being a keeper in a whole clan of keepers. She's killed lots of humans, lots of knights who have, dared to enter the lands, who have abused their power, who have, it negatively affected her personally in a lot of ways. And then versus on the other side,
Mm.
he's a knight who has seen the worst that, any of the keepers have ever done. He's seen his own men slaughtered. He's, upkept these moral and these standards of his brotherhood for the sense of loyalty, but then also knows that some of the things that he's done is wrong. He feels a lot of guilt over it. And she, in the same turn, starts to realize through her relationship with Karsten that not all of the knights she came across were bad, and she probably should not have killed some of them. Oops, right? So that
Ugh.
causes a lot of internal guilt for her. So then we have
So,
pipeline from I don't know what's going on with this world building. I don't know why they have beef to continuously asking why questions to be like, okay, well, why do they have beef? Oh, it's because Alfheim was destroyed. Okay, well, why were the knights and the keepers created? Oh, they were to keep them separate and to keep them segregated from one another so those things don't happen anymore. Well, why do they have beef? Because there's a lot of corruption in both of those factions, which cause them to murder each other unbeknownstly, thinking that the other one is just evil, right? And so then, well, okay, well, why does Adelaide not like him the moment she basically finds out he's a knight? Well, because she has all this beef and all these things in her past that have to do with negative connotations with the knights. And then we're seeing, okay, not only are we seeing the history of this world, we're seeing then the personal ramifications of that history on the main characters themselves. And now we have depth into their own personal history. We have the whys for the why they act the way that they do. And then we can kind of go and base the story off from there. And I can even go further to be like, okay, well, why would they start trusting each other? Because they're forced to work together in this new faction that's created to hunt down the spirits that were released from the mountains, right? And
mm,
so I can keep asking the question why, and then I create the world and the characters through continuously asking, well, why would this be so? Well, why is this the way that it is? Rather than just going, I really want it to be in a snowy area because I want it to be a Viking book. So I'm just going to say it is that way versus me saying, okay, why is it that way? It's because the
yeah.
mountain was created to hold all these spirits and to ward off humans from entering New Alfheim. And because it's a large mountain, it automatically has snow because it's tall,
Hmm.
right? It's like Mount Everest,
Hmm.
the higher you go, the windier it gets. And because it's a Viking inspired book, obviously everything's going to be based on, Scandinavia, Norse stuff.
Yeah.
Um, and that's going to impact obviously the story as well. If I want it to be inspired by a specific old culture like the Vikings, then I can pull from that as well and then go, okay, well, now how, like how you said, how does that impact this? If I want
Yeah.
it to be in a snowy landscape, how does that impact trade? How does it impact the setup? If I want it to be Viking inspired, they had different clans and they had their jarls who ruled over them. Well, how is that going to
Hmm.
impact the main character Adelaide going into a town full of knights who are basically her sworn enemy, and you have a jarl there who is in power? How is that going to affect her, especially if they were from the knights or if they weren't from the knights? How does that impact her trust of them? So it's why and how for
Mm.
me, and that creates the what, where, and characters, and that's how they all work in tandem with one another rather than just creating one on a character sheet and then pretending like I knew
Hmm.
everything all along.
Yeah. Oh, it's good. It's working backwards. It's a really cool technique, I think, because I think a lot of people sort of start at the like the little inklings of world building and then they work their way up to what they really want to do. But if you know what you want to do to begin with, then you can work back and figure out, why and how it's happening.
Yeah, I definitely think so. It's like working backwards, and all I basically have to do to get all of that started is to think of, okay, characters, romance, plot. So all I knew was that I wanted Adelaide
Hmm.
and Kirsten. I already had their names in mind. I already knew their kind of dynamic that I wanted them to have. And then I knew, okay, plot. I know her, she wants to be, I want her to be kind of held up as a religious idol. I know there wants to be a war going on. I didn't even know originally a war against what. And then after that, everything else sort of fell into place because then I had, okay, I know characters, I know how I want them to interact with each other, and I know what I want to be the plot happening around them, and then I could build from there versus like creating a sheet. I never liked those sheets. Like I like world building. I always try to
Yeah.
fill out those sheets, and like it never satisfied me, and I would always throw everything out from it anyways. And then two, related to that as well, once you've done this and you keep asking why or how until you basically run out of questions or answers for yourself, or you just plain old don't know, you can then go, okay, well, how do I explain these things to the reader? How do I introduce them to the reader? And then you can start creating your outline from there to be like, okay, well,
Hmm.
the very first thing that I have in the prologue for the Viking book is the main character Adelaide basically discovering that someone very close to her has been murdered by knights, and so then you are automatically getting the history between the keepers and the knights. This, the information that she's an elf, the information that she's very much in love with her land and her people and her clan and her family, and then you're also getting the sorrow that she personally has on why she does not like the knights. Because then when we flip to Carson's point of view, and it's revealed that he is a knight, then we're automatically knowing, okay, right off the bat, before we even jump into chapter one, we know the beef is going to happen. We know that there's going to be enemies to
Yeah.
lovers. And so then you can kind of break down, okay, like what does the reader need to know and when they need to know it, and that can help you build your outline, because you're like, okay, they need to know this fact before chapter 5, let me introduce it into chapter 3. What kind of scene can I create to show this piece of information as well as move the plot forward? Because each scene, at least in the beginning part
Mhm.
of books for me, between like the first 10 to 50,000 words, almost all of them always reveal something about the world, something about the characters, and or something about the plot, and moves the plot forward. Rather than having one scene that only does one
Yeah.
thing, I always try to combine 2 or 3 of those things together to move the story along really, really quickly.
Yeah, I think we had addressed that also in one of our earlier chats about how you need like some sort of action happening. You can't have any useless content really in your novels. I mean, there's always going to be that stuff that you add in that's like, beautiful and descriptive and just like, fun word candy, but even like even with that, you're going to have to keep things moving all the time. And you can be a bit slower with that with longer novels, but something with like short stories, I've learned especially, it just has to be like on. So you want your foundations in place so you know where you're going. So you're not just like stuck there babbling away for a little while. I don't know what I'm doing next, and I don't know what's happening in my world or my story. So I'm just going to like write and write and write until I know what's going to happen. And you can have a lot of editing to do.
Yeah. And I mean, too, I think that's a lot of problems that people, and this is coming from a previous pantser myself. There's a lot of problems I personally had when I was
Yeah.
pantsing, is that I was trying to hit just a word count or just to finish a chapter versus actually trying to
Hmm.
move the plot forward. So I'd have really long books with a long part of the middle with nothing basically happening. And then I, kind of fell in love with outlining, became a plotter. And then from there, I've kind of developed this, system throughout time where I'm focusing instead on the why and how versus just wanting to fill it full of things that I personally want to write. Like it would
Yeah.
be nice if every single scene in my book I just absolutely love to write and I have no problem, and I've been envisioning it in my head for forever, because those scenes are the easiest to write, of course. When you've had
Hmm.
them in your head, you've
Hmm.
played them over and over again. But in reality, like you need to have those scenes that you think are boring because you know your world so well,
Yeah.
but you're just basically having this scene to make the reader understand your world. And that's usually when I kind of like slow down and I'm like, oh no. Or if I run out of my outline and I've caught up to my outline and I haven't plotted any further, I'm like, fuck. I don't know what I'm doing. That's where I am right now. And I hate it.
Yeah, yeah. I'm still I would still call myself a plantser, um, because I have that combination going on. I've tried to be more organized because the thing that happened with me was the reason Sintera, which I have like sitting beside me, staring at me all hours of the day. The reason it's taken so long to finish just the first draft of the first novel, this is a series, is because I was just like writing it at random and I didn't know what I was doing with it at all. And I just would write it and then I would come back the next year and write more, come back the next year, edit, write more. And it was just like the first half over and over and over again. And when I finally was like, okay, let's figure out what's going on here, then I was able to finish it. I didn't know what I was doing. I was like, I like writing this. I love my characters. But I don't know why they exist. I don't know what the point is.
The power of why.
Yeah, exactly. Should be our podcast title today. The power of why. But at some point, I would like to teach myself more about the non fantasy world building and get into that. So maybe that'll be something we can talk about in the future too.
Yeah, and I feel like too, a lot of people assume, oh, you have to do so much more world building with fantasy or sci-fi, especially if it's in a different universe, which is kind of true. But also, there's so many books that I've read where if it's a small town in the USA, some backwater place, and it doesn't exist, but I feel like I've been there, you know? And when you can
Mm,
make a town, whether it's real or fake, or if it's in this world or a different world, feel so tangible and so real, even if like it's a story that takes place in a single room, if I feel like I'm in that room, that's because you were really good at doing the setting, the descriptions, and the world building. Because even if you're like, okay, this is just a white
yeah.
padded room, okay, well, why is the character there? That's world building, that's plot. So,
Yeah, exactly.
every story requires it regardless. And I feel like, too, so many, for me at least, so many contemporary stories and so many contemporary romances specifically, or contemporary fantasy novels, excuse me, they fall so much more flat for me because they think that they don't have to do as much world building because they're contemporary or
Yeah.
because they happen in this world. But I'm like, okay, let's think about it for a second. If you're writing a story happening in this world in modern day, and let's say it has vampires in it, well, how has the world been affected by there being vampires? That is still world building. If you're just going to
Mm-hmm.
basically slap on the title of vampire onto the nearest fictional billionaire and then just slap it on a cover, that's really
Yeah.
great for you to get something out really quickly, but for the most part, I'm going to forget about your book even if I enjoyed it 5 seconds from now. It's not going to linger in my mind because none of it felt tangible. Versus going, okay, there's an entire cabal of
Yeah.
vampires who've been secretly ruling the world and they've impacted all of these different things. Okay, well, that kind of changes the history of our planet. Let's talk about that a little bit more.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think there's that sort of assumption that, oh, I'm writing in an existing world, so everyone's just going to know what that world is like. They know what the streets look like. They know what the buildings look like. Like maybe they don't. Maybe they don't live in a country that's like the one you're writing at all. So tell them.
Yeah, and I think this was something I wanted to bring up too is that, having a Western assumption and assuming everybody's going to understand what your Western
Hmm.
Texas town is going to look like is not accurate, especially if, your book gets published in other countries, if it's translated, all these other things. People aren't going to understand what your specific like mention of, something is, like a Roomba. They might know what the fuck a Roomba is.
Yeah.
And so Roomba's in my head because I watched Hocus Pocus 2 the other day where like she's flying on
Oh,
Roombas
yeah.
and it just made me giggle so much.
Oh,
Um
my God.
but yeah, don't make the assumption that automatically your reader's going to know. Like obviously most of your readers in Western world are going to understand, but if you create, like, you don't have to explain everything in so much detail, especially if for the most part people are going to know what you're talking about, but giving good world building in the way that the place feels and the way that it has that depth and that richness, even if somebody in like India does not know what a Roomba is, right, and they get your book, they should be able to infer through your writing what it is, on top of being able to go, even if they're super duper confused about what the hell the Roomba is, they should still be invested enough in your story by your world building and by your writing to be willing to stick it out to figure out what the fuck that is. And I mean, we learn that so much in fantasy because we might be mentioning some, like far off land with plants we can't even truly visualize, but if we're invested in the story enough, we will wait to figure it out.
Yeah, exactly. Never underestimate how far description will go. It's and even if you are writing for an audience that you know, because I remember, I mean, I'm in my hometown right now of Winnipeg, and I remember considering writing in Winnipeg when I was younger because when I was writing, I guess when I was maybe 13 or something, I had this fantasy story with my friend. I think I've mentioned it before, this like 9,000 page RPG that we would write. And we kind of wrote it since it was back and forth conversation, and a lot of it was just like chatting. It was kind of written in a vacuum. It had no actual setting. It was just our characters talking, and then sometimes they'd be like in a room somewhere, and it was just like it was a story with no setting, and it was very weird. And I remember when I started wanting to make it into something more tangible, that was because we'd built up these characters just through talking back and forth as them, and they became pretty great and in depth. I'm like, I want to tell the story of these characters, but I had to figure out where they even were. And so I was writing in Winnipeg, and one of my first thoughts was just like, well, Winnipeg, it's like it's just a city. I wouldn't want to write them here because it's so familiar. It's just like a basic city. And I wasn't even thinking that, well, not everyone lives in Winnipeg. Not everyone has the same experience with Winnipeg as you. And then on the same, on the same wavelength, now that I live generally in Montreal, I can sort of see I live there, but it's a city I love, and I don't really love Winnipeg. And being there, it's like, okay, well, now I kind of want to write something that's set in Montreal, and I want to tell people all about it. And for the people who do live there and know it, it's going to be like a love letter to the city. So like you just win in all areas. Like even people who live there, I mean, imagine, you pick up a book that's set in your city, and you're gonna want to hear all the little details and all the little stuff about it and go, oh, this is so cool. That's that like little coffee shop I went to when I was going to university or something. So it's always a good thing to do, to just fully flesh things out, no matter how familiar to you they are.
Yeah, definitely. And I think too, it's a mix of a setting, like you said, but also a mix of like the feeling of a place. Like if you ever, like if you today visited your old house you used to live in Winnipeg,
I did.
and so you have
Yeah.
that deep, yeah. So you have that deep nostalgic feeling. So, when you were a kid, you had different feelings. You might have like hated the banister. You might have thought like the wood in the floor looked like a clown face and you were scared of it, like whatever it may have been, right? Those small details when you were a kid gave your home a different kind of feeling to it, right? Like it was home, but then maybe there was something creepy in it, or maybe you loved something about it. But then, put you a couple years later going back to the same location, and then you have this feeling of nostalgic about it. But the characters feeling a specific way about the places that they're going is world building as well, because then you again ask that why question: why do they feel that way about that place? And then it's not just the description
Hmm.
of like, there's a brown chair outside of the coffee shop. It's the description of, oh my god, I remember when they had these blue chairs that were there and they would squeak every time that they moved and they were so annoying, and now I'm frustrated as I'm sitting here, but also happy that they changed these chairs. Like small little details like that make it feel so much more real and tangible. And they don't have to be with every single thing, but I've noticed if you really want people to feel like they're physically in a specific scene, adding those types of details and those types of sensory things, and then also asking why would that character describe things that in that specific way, why would that character notice that specific detail. So one of the things I learned this through was through writing my queer space opera Spaceborne, because the main character had a military background, so she automatically described things differently than say my character Adelaide in my Viking book would describe things. Adelaide's a little bit more prose heavy. She
Hmm.
grew up reading a lot of like fairy tales, mythologies, and her family was all full of magic, so they had a little bit more of a romantic way of speaking, versus Soraya in Spaceborne. She's military background, her entire family comes from military, she's very blunt to the point. And then when she does describe things in a more prose like way, it's because she's having usually a PTSD episode and everything kind of gets a little bit hazy. So you go from a very blunt version of description to very out of body experience, so you can feel it with her. And the only way I was figured out I
Hmm.
could do that was through world building and connecting that world building to her as a character to figure out how she would act in specific situations, how she would describe things, and then I would use that information to dictate how I was writing a specific scene, thus pulling the reader further into the scene by the way that I was writing it, not just the way that the scene in my head looked, but actually making it so that that scene in my head, other people felt like they were a part of it as well, versus the character just going through it. Then the reader goes through it too. And you can use small things like that to pull the reader in more than just having, here's nice window dressing. Hope you enjoy it. I described the sunset 5 times in this book. Here's another one.
Exactly. And just like, and even say, you say window dressing, but like if picturing it as a window, like you don't want the reader to be like peering in at your character and just seeing them go through something. Like you want them to feel like they are there with them, or that they are them. And those details are the things that will do that.
Yeah, if your reader literally says like, "Oh, I felt that," or like, "I resonated with that," or "I literally thought I was like in this scene," or they start self-inserting themselves into your character, especially if that person who's reading is so far different from your main character, you're doing
Mm.
something right on a lot of different fronts to be able to execute world building with your plot, connect the two together, and then connect your reader into your character, into your story. Because it's one thing just for someone to read your story and go, oh, I resonate with this main character because of the way that they're feeling, versus being like, oh my god, I feel for this character, I feel like this happened to me. And then being able to
Hmm.
connect what's happening to them to maybe their own personal trauma or their own personal things that they've gone through, to make them fully see this character as a person. That is like when stories stick with me, and like I can't stop thinking about them when I feel not just for the character, but I feel like I am the character.
Basically, the big goal is to, traumatize your reader a little bit and make them cry.
I mean, maybe that's our goal, but also at the same time, it could be happy feelings. We might write those one
Yeah.
day, but not today.
If Honestly, like, I've got some stuff in Centera and I want to make someone cry. If I make someone cry, then I think I've done a good job.
Oh yeah, if I start crying during a scene, I know I'm gonna start hitting some people. But at the same time, we
Yeah.
want people, like if there's a kiss scene happening, I want the reader to feel like they're about to be kissed. If there's a smut scene,
Yeah.
oh my god, wait, I need to take a cold shower. If there's, like an angry scene, I want them to get pissed off. I want to get them pissed off on the, like feel like they were the one who was offended in the middle of it. That I notice is when I'm the most
Mhm.
emotionally invested
Yeah.
in a story, whether it's a movie, a book, TV show, whatever it is. That's when I can't let it go, get obsessive, usually read or write fan fiction about it, and it'll become my new favorite thing because I am
Mhm.
all about what is happening and what's going on. And like I've read so many fan fiction where I've gotten this invested and I've been so attached to it, even if it's not that well written. And I can excuse like grammar errors or, so many times fan fiction writers will be like,
Yeah.
sorry, English is not my first language. And then they'll write the most beautiful thing you've ever seen in your fucking life, but they might forget like a comma or two.
Yeah.
I can forgive all of that if I'm emotionally invested enough in a piece of work. So you can literally be like, oh, English isn't my first language, but I want to write in English because that's what's going to get me, probably published, with the most range. Oh, I've never written this genre
Mhm.
before. I've never written this kind of scene before. Like whatever your doubts may be will be blocked out by the idea of you making your character or your reader feel for your character or feel like your character, and you can only really do that through making them actually feel like everything is real, and the way you do that is through world building. Mic
Damn.
drop.
I I think that's a great spot to wrap it up on. And also, since we've gotten into characters a little bit, I think that, we'll probably talk about some more magic-y stuff in the next couple episodes, but probably flow into some stuff, some more character work, because, you build your world and then you want to create in-depth characters. So if you're curious about that sort of thing, I think that would be a logical next step for our discussions.
Yeah, I definitely think so. And if you guys have any other topics you want us to hit, please let them in the comments down below, or feel free to DM us on any of our social medias and let us know what you want to see.
Yes, please do, because input is always fun, and collaborating creatively is important.
Yes, we appreciate the collaboration. It's not just the two of us. Consider you all part of the process.
Yes, so with that, we're going to wrap up the world building chat, I think. I feel like I've said everything I have had to say. And how about you, Jenna?
Just please world build. Please. So many people hate it, but I love it. So please do yourself a favor and do it. Well, thank you guys so much for watching. We hope you liked this episode, and feel free to join us for the next one. Our episodes come out every single Tuesday.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.